One of the central jobs of front-end development is managing data and how it's conveyed on the screen. Having a methodology for doing this is important, but it has to be built on a firm foundation of JavaScript knowledge. A key part of that foundation is understanding how JavaScript arrays work. So I've compiled a list of the top 5 array methods that every JavaScript developer should know. Let's get to it. Alright, and as always, all the material for this episode can be found on my GitHub. I'll put a link in the description for that. And we're in this folder number 8, arrays, and you can just open up the arrays.html. So JavaScript gives us a bunch of built-in functionality in arrays. And as I said, I'm going to go over my top 5 built-in array loops to use when developing. Now, just for context, if you just create a variable a in the console and just say a dot, you're going to see a list of all the different things you can do. So my list here is by no means exhaustive. I put it together looking at patterns of my development process at work. So this doesn't mean that everything I cover today is going to be 100% applicable to you in whatever job you have or will get. The first one that I'm covering is actually 2, so it's kind of cheating, but it's my list, so deal with it. And that's the standard map and forEach loops. Both map and forEach perform a function for each element in an array. Mapping is used when an array must be returned, while forEach loop is used when only an action needs to be performed. So this is essentially going to replace the need for a standard for loop. Now in the coding example, we're going to have this array with the values 1, 3, 5, 2, and 4. When we click our forEach button, which is that first one, we're taking our example array dot forEach, and we're passing in an arrow function, which takes the current item and optionally a second argument, which gives you the index. And in the case of our first example, we're just logging out a value. And since we don't actually need to return anything, that's why we're using the forEach. So if we click log values doubled, you're seeing we're getting 2, 6, 10, 4, and 8 out of our array 1, 3, 5, 2, and 4. We're logging out item times 2, and then at index. On the other hand, for our second, what we want to do is log out an array that's a copy of the first one, except all the values are doubled. If we wanted to use a traditional for loop, what we would have to do is create an empty array, then loop through our example array, and append double values to that initially empty array. In this case, all we're doing is taking our example array, dot map, and for each item, we're returning item.to. Whatever is returned is going to be in that new array. And that's important to note because that means that the copy array that's getting returned from the map doesn't necessarily have the same types of data as the first one. So for example, I could say example array.numbers.map, take the value x, and return a string literal that's returning x. And in this case, we're taking in an array of numbers and returning back an array of strings. However, in our second example function, all we're doing is doubling it, and therefore when we log arrays of doubled values, we're getting this array back with all of the values doubled. Next, let's take a look at filter. Now sometimes it's important to show just a portion of the data that we have access to, and that's where our filter method comes in. It also returns a new array, and what it's doing is looping through an array and running a given function on every element. For each element, if true is returned, the element will be included in the returned array, hence filter. So in our coding example, we're going to use 3 different types of example arrays now. Example array numbers from before, as well as example array strings, and example array with objects. So we can start looking at slightly more complex data. Here we have 3 different buttons, one for each type of data. I also wanted to note that in all 3 examples, I use a different type of function, and you can really use whatever you want. The first is using a standard function, as you see here, where we're taking example array.filter and running this function, which is going to log true if a number is even. And that's using that percentage sign, which is called modulo, which gives a remainder. And so, for example, if we say 1 modulo 2, the value is 1, 2, 0, 3, 1, 4, 0. We're always getting 0 if the number's even. And in our example, what we're doing is just saying, take the opposite of that. So 4 will be true, 3 false, 2 true, 1 false. Therefore, we're returning true for all of our even numbers, which means all of our even numbers are going to be in that returned array. And if we say log even numbers, we're logging out an array with just those even numbers. Next, we're just using a standard arrow function for our filter, where we're taking our example array string and returning true if that string.length is less than 4. Therefore, if I go up, you see some of these are longer than others, D, E, F, G, H, I altogether. That's not going to be in our returned array. The same thing goes for M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V. Finally, we're dealing with our object array. Here, we're using an arrow function that has an implicit return value, which you'll see a lot of times when you're just looking for a specific attribute. In our case, we're just saying, filter that objects array and find it where the object dot is married. So in this list of people, Bill and Betty are married, whereas Charles, Christy, and Richard are not. So if we log married objects and open that up, we get a response array where Bill and Betty, both married, are found in the array, and everyone else is not. So let's clear that off and move on to sort. Now, as with filter, the sort method gives us more control over how we use an array. All of these do. It also returns a new array, and this array contains all of the same elements. However, the order of the elements is going to be determined by the function that's passed to the filter. The exception to this is that primitives will be sorted without a function being passed, from smallest to largest. As for the function that's passed, anytime you're dealing with non-standard functionality, the function will take 2 arguments, each representing an item. If a negative value is returned, the first item is placed first. Otherwise, the second is. And that's probably pretty confusing, so let's actually take a look at it. We're first going to do some basic sorting using the default functionality, and then we'll write a sorting function for the object array. So this first one that we see here is example array numbers dot sort, and as you would expect, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's your standard simple functionality. Below that, we have example array with objects dot sort, and we're passing in this function youngest first. Youngest first is taking A and B, which is pretty conventional. And here we're just saying return A.age minus B.age. And so if we look back above, if a negative value is returned, the first item is going to be placed first. Therefore, if you have Bill first and Richard second, 45 minus 16 is going to be a positive number. Therefore, Bill goes second, Richard goes first. And when we click this sort youngest to oldest, we see 16, 23, 32, 42, 45. I hope I explained that okay. It's something that took me a while to actually get the hang of, and even now, sometimes I'll mess it up. So the easiest way to get the hang of it is just by writing a few sorting functions. Now the find method is used to identify the first instance of a matching element in an array. It runs through an array, and it runs the given function with each element as its argument. If a true value is returned, the element is then returned by find. Now this could be used to check to see if a certain element is in an array, or it can also be used to retrieve that value to actually use it. And in our coding example, we're going to do both of those. So let's put things into action. First, we'll identify whether a given number can be found in our list, and then we'll retrieve a member from the objects list. So for this first button, what we're doing is on click, we're finding the number to find, which is just taking the value from our find number input, which is the input field here. We're parsing that as an integer, so we can look for a direct match. And then we're saying example array numbers dot find, and if x is equal to the number, then we're going to return yes, otherwise nope. And so if we say 0, does our list have 0? Nope. Good. Do we have 2? Yes. Do we have 5? Yes. 7? Nope. As we would expect. Our next example we're saying example array with objects.find, taking in an object, and if our object name equals Charles, then return that value. So in this case, we're actually logging out the object that includes Charles. And if we open it up, we can see name Charles, and we get the entire object. So clear that off. Now our final method is join, which is used to merge array elements together as one string. It first converts all the array elements to a string and then joins them together. By default, the elements are separated by a comma, but you may pass a string argument where you can set the delimiter to whatever you want. So let's play around with our string array a little bit. So what we're doing first is getting our value from our join input, and then we're saying example array strings dot join on that value. So if there's no value here, we just see the entire alphabet. However, if I say comma space, we can join it with all of those spaces. Now sometimes you might actually want the ability for it to end with WX and YZ. And if you do a quick Google search, there are a few really simple ways to handle that. Now finally, I wanted to put this all together and show where things can get really powerful using a practical example that's inspired from a real life project I worked on. So some of these methods are returning arrays, with the exception of forEach, join, and I'll also have to add find to that as well. Now we can chain these looping methods together and stack their functionality on top of each other. So each outward method will work off the array from the previous one. If we look at the little snippet below, we can take some array and first sort it, which will return a sorted array. We can then map over that, and from that mapped over array, we can then filter. So what does that look like? Well, we're going to take our object array and we're going to render it out after doing some processing. First, we're going to filter out individuals of a chosen age from an input field. We're then going to sort them based on their age and map through, returning an array of HTML strings to render. Finally, we're going to join them all together, so our end result is going to be a giant string, which we will append to that div that we referenced above. So again, we're using the same object as before, and this is what the code looks like. When we click on this button, we're going to record the age from our input field, and then we're going to set our chain content.innerHTML to the string result of all of these methods. We start with our array of objects, and the first thing we're going to do is filter for age. So as long as that objects.age is not equal to the age that was passed, then return true. After that, we're going to sort youngest first using that same function as we did before. After that, we're going to map through our array of objects. And for each object, we're going to return a string. So for this, it might actually help if I go into the code itself. This comment here is unnecessary. It's just used to handle the syntax highlighting. But at its core, all our map is doing is returning a string for each object. That string includes HTML code, which is going to change based on the person's name, whether he or she is married, age, and sex. Finally, we have an array of strings, and we're just going to join them all together, one after another, which is why we're adding this empty string. So when we click render all but, if nobody matches the age that we give, we should see the entire family. We click that here, and there they all are. Richard, who's single at 16, Charles, Christy, and then at the bottom, Betty and Bill. You can see 16, 23, 32, 42, 45. Let's say we want to take anyone who's 32 out of this, render all but, boom, and she's gone. If I say 42, she's back, but now Betty's gone. Because remember, we're not actually changing the initial array. Each method is creating a copy. So what we have in the end is an extremely practical application of using array methods to take data and render it to the screen. There are so many applications for what we've done here. You can quickly think of so many applications for this kind of logic, whether it's using different tabs and displaying information from the same data source based on that, or having drop-down menus to sort things differently, all of which could result in re-rendering a portion of the page without having to refresh. Either way, it's something that could be used in a bunch of different applications. So what are my final thoughts? Array looping methods are a quick way to step up your JavaScript game. Some of these can be a little difficult to conceptualize at first, but it gets easier as you work with them. So practice. Make a few examples and mess around with it a little bit. You might find that certain ones are harder for you to conceptualize at first, but after you get used to practicing them, you become a wizard. So I think that'll do it for today. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. I hope it's something you got something out of. If you did, feel free to subscribe to get more content like this. Dropping likes, comments, all are going to help grow the channel. And if you got this far, thank you for staying to the end, and have a great day.